I mean, it's pragmatic for the center, but one tries to imagine what the NDP slogan is going to be at the next election. Like, we put the buddy into budget, like.
Hi, and welcome to the first episode of The Breach Show. I'm Donya Ziaee, I'll be your host, and I'm here in our Montreal studio. I'm really excited to be here with Pam Palmater, Jones, Martin Lukacs. They're going to be making regular appearances on our show as analysts, and down the line we'll have guests on the show as well. Pam is joining us from Toronto. She's a Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, and author. Ella's here from Halifax. She's a poet, professor, and organizer. And Martin is in our Montreal studio here with me. He's a journalist and the managing editor of The Breach. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. So on today's show, we're going to talk about what everybody has been talking about this week, which is the new deal between the Liberals and the NDP. And then we're going to also look at the political landscape in Canada in the aftermath of the Convoy and the occupation of Ottawa last month. And we're going to talk about whether that landscape has changed and how movements on the left are or should be responding to it. So first, the Liberal NDP deal. It's called a Confidence and Supply Agreement, and the NDP has committed to supporting the Liberals on the next 4 upcoming budgets and not push any non-confidence motions. And that's all in exchange for the Liberals fulfilling certain policies. If the agreement holds, the Liberals would govern until June 2025, and then there would likely be an election in the fall of that year. So before we get to interpreting why this happened, what do we think of what's outlined in the deal?
Well, I guess the first thing to clear up is that it is not, as the Conservatives are making it out to be in their kind of fever dreams, radical power grab. It is not, as the current interim leader of the Conservative Party put it, the decimation of the oil and gas industry. I think the right wing is, making it out to be the entrenchment of this extreme agenda, but I think they've called it socialism through the back door. But I tend to think it's more like the NDP falling through a Liberal trapdoor. The agreement itself is pretty abysmally vague. There are practically no binding details when it comes to the policy initiatives in question, which is a concern. And most of the policies outlined on pharmacare, reconciliation, emissions reductions, action on long-term care homes, taxes on the wealthy, they're all pre-existing Liberal promises. The outlet The Maple did an analysis and found that 22 of the 23 fiscal and social spending promises were actually just extensions of previous promises or slight modifications. So, and curiously, the Liberal government, when they had a majority, when they had much more cooperative Liberal or NDP premiers and provinces, they curiously didn't move forward on those policies then. The NDP has signed a deal in which they have committed to supporting 4 subsequent budgets and basically 3 years of majority level rule. They basically had one shot, one opportunity. I think I'm inadvertently quoting Eminem, but they had like one opportunity, one moment of leverage, to extract significant concessions. And what they've gotten, to me, doesn't seem that at all.
And we also talk about how the photo that Jagmeet Singh has on Twitter in order to advertise this, which I think is quite bizarre, right? So it's this black and white photo on a phone with a cord. Like, I don't know, maybe this is something within the Parliament building so people can't hack your cell phones or whatever, but he's got like a phone cord like wrapped around him. He's looking out the window and you can't see his face. And of course he like harkens back to, Tommy Douglas and Jack Layton. And it seems a concession that he doesn't have a vision for the left in the contemporary age. Like, you're literally trying to create this like 1940s black and white photo with like, a landline, like, this is like the spirit of the NDP. So it seems like a concession that the only thing that the NDP is running on is a kind of fumes of invoking these moments, but doesn't have any vision for what, a leftist party and a leftist like actual movement can look like in 2022 and beyond. So I just wanted to say that the branding is very, very strange here, but also like very telling, right?
I mean, we're going to talk plenty about what we think the NDP's strategy, if there was one, was in all of this. But just to stay with the question of like what's even in the agreement for a second, Pam, there was some stuff in there about reconciliation. It was actually one of the main policy planks in the document that the government shared. There are points in there about Indigenous housing funds, action on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. What do you make of those commitments?
Well, they're not new. So I think Martin said at the outset, these are things that we've seen both in the Liberal platform and the NDP platform. So when they were in election mode and you look at their reconciliation sections, the vast majority of it was very similar, if not identical. The only difference in the NDP was that there were a little bit more towards supporting self-determination. But ultimately, you don't see any party anywhere talking about genocide, making the genocide of Indigenous peoples an urgent national issue that needs urgent national attention on an ongoing basis. You don't see them talking about land back in a substantive way, how it's going to roll out, and the transfer of crown lands to First Nations all across the country. You don't really see them talking about these very substantive issues, like not just the National Action Plan to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but the how and the standard by which we're going to measure Canadian laws, policies, regulations, and practices on a go-forward basis. You would have thought potentially there was an opportunity to bring those things together, because obviously when the NDP is in opposition, they're like, oh, the Liberals aren't doing enough on Indigenous files. Oh, they're not doing enough on genocide.
On the question of climate, there were a few things listed in there as well. What was your assessment of those, Martin?
I mean, again, most of it is repetition, and I think probably the most damning thing about that is that this agreement was announced the day after we saw, temperature 30 degrees Celsius above normal in the Arctic and 40 degrees Celsius above normal in Antarctica. And I mean, that to me is damning of the lack of ambition in the pledges and policies that are contained in that climate section. There's mention of emissions reductions, but as we know, they've continued to climb every year, in large part because the Trudeau government is giving the oil and gas industry basically everything that they want. Right now in Parliament, we're seeing hearings on the emissions cap, and Big Oil is working vigorously to ensure that basically any emissions cap that gets set will still, through a bunch of kind of smoke and mirrors and magic solutions like carbon capture and storage, will mean that it doesn't actually impede their ability to double, triple production of the tar sands over the next several decades. So there's nothing in this agreement, to me, that puts any binding guarantees on that actually not continuing to be the status quo.
We'll talk about what the NDP's rationale is in all of this, but I thought we could start by first maybe exploring why the Liberals have signed this deal and why they've done that now and their strategy behind it. Elle or anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense for the Liberals. Like, they secure the vote. They don't have to worry, as Pam said, about every vote being a vote of confidence, everything being overthrown the Liberals. It's not clear what the NDP think they're getting out of this. I mean, it's pragmatic for the centre, but one tries to imagine what the NDP slogan is going to be at the next election. Like, we put the buddy into budget, like how do you then, advocate, right? But, then what are you going to go and say to NDP voters? Like, vote for us. We're different from the Liberals, except we committed to vote with the Liberals on everything. So we're not actually different from the Liberals, but you should vote for us anyway. I mean, the NDP supported, Wet'suwet'en, like not the people, like the actual incursions into Wet'suwet'en. They've been very disappointing there. They've been consistently disappointing, like the Emergencies Act. They had no principled opposition to that. Like during debate, thinking about what that actually means in Canada, they voted along with that. And of course, the excuse has been, well, we don't want the government to be overthrown. What is that? Because what can we point to that the NDP have actually even done in the last few years to challenge the Liberals to actually have any kind of difference? So in some ways, I suppose, yeah, I mean, it just makes clear what's always existed. The NDP are the Liberal light, and they're just like admitting it and going along with that. But then it's hard to see what that offers for anybody who actually votes NDP. The lane is now open for the Greens, but we know they're a mess and they're not going to come into that lane. So it, as I said, it really leaves the question of, at the same time as we're doing this pretense that, oh, you know, the Liberals have gone left and this is like, you know, a socialist coup in Canada. In fact, the reality is it's a centrist coup, and it's absolutely left nowhere else for people to go.
I mean, somebody asked Jagmeet Singh yesterday if the deal could benefit the Liberals instead of the NDP. And he said, well, you know, people might say someone else did it, but frankly, I don't care. I want this to be done because I think it's good for people. I mean, he's even admitting that this isn't necessarily going to benefit the party at the polls or in terms of popularity. So, Martin, I wanted to ask you, like, what is the strategy here? I mean, maybe I can ask you the question about the Liberal strategy as well, but also then the NDP strategy.
Well, I think one of the probably the best ways to understand this deal is as a pact signed between Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau, but serving both of their interests and serving the kind of institutional needs of both of their parties. So I think Elle is exactly right that like this is a strategic coup for the Liberals. They're the ones who come out, I think, probably just thrilled by this. You know, Justin Trudeau's leadership was in question after the last election. There was all kinds of talk about, you know, how soon the transition to a new leader would happen, whether Chrystia Freeland or someone like Mark Carney. And I think this has basically put that in formaldehyde. Like it ensures that he has 3-4 years to establish a legacy. You know, that's what the media are talking about. But that basically solves any kind of internal challenge to his party. So he must be thrilled. You know, they basically managed to nullify whatever genuine leverage the NDP would have as an opposition party over the coming years. And in order to do that, they, you know, have to make relatively low cost concessions that I think they might have wanted to make anyways. You know, a pharmacare plan basically. You know, brought in slow enough that Big Pharma won't be upset. Probably we're talking over like 10 to 12 year range, sometime in the early 2030s. And, you know, a dental care plan that is not going to also cost them very much. So I think the Liberals have come out of it extremely well. And I think the kind of operative principle of Liberal statecraft, which is, you know, things will have to change in order for them to remain the same. Is basically at work here as well. The kind of politics are summed up in the mantra that Jagmeet and some of his closest advisors repeat regularly, which is that like we're in Parliament to get things done for people, you know. And another one of his favorite lines is like, you know, Trudeau says the right things, but he doesn't follow through.
Nice things.
He says nice things, but he doesn't follow through. And I mean, that to me seems like a reduction of the mission of the NDP to simply being a more honest and effective practitioner of the politics of the Liberal Party. Basically kind of like a taskmaster liberalism, you know, like we're going to do a better job than the Liberals. And I think it's basically the party is bereft of any kind of real like animating vision these days that would anchor its oppositional work in an alternative vision of society, a society that's governed by values of cooperation and solidarity rather than, you know, competition and profit. So this to me in some ways is a kind of culmination of that politics.
Pam, I'm curious what you think about the NDP strategy too. I mean, what we've been hearing so far is that this deal basically takes away most or any leverage that the NDP had left in Parliament. Elle mentioned, for example, the military spending. Like the NDP's already said, they're not going to oppose increases in military spending as long as this deal is upheld by the Liberals. What do you think of their strategy here?
I think it's pretty much a concession speech, really. I mean, where have the NDP been since the election? You hear from them so rarely. You don't see the leader out there. You don't see the NDP MPs out there making news, challenging issues, advocating for issues that are important. I mean, they've all but disappeared. I mean, this is the most amount of media or speaking that I've seen them do in a very long time. So to me, it just kind of sounded like a concession speech, and it doesn't put them any worse off than they were. They weren't really doing anything, which is unfortunate, but that's the status. And now they're attached to this agreement, and they're not going to oppose anything, and what they're agreeing to isn't really off from what was happening anyway. So I just don't think it's that significant, except for the singular, we're not going to have to worry about a confidence vote every time, and the Conservatives trying to make a mess of everything, whether it's good or bad. From a Liberal perspective, fantastic. They get to proceed with what they want to do. They don't have to worry about a non-confidence vote. And they didn't really have to give up too much. I mean, had the NDP said, listen, you need to close down the Trans Mountain Pipeline and I will support you for the next 3 years. Wow. And there are certain segments in society who would rather the government focus on what the needs are right now. So the healthcare crisis, all of our workers that we considered essential workers, what are we doing for them now? What are we going to do for them now? What are we doing for the homeless? Can we refocus back on the skyrocketing incarceration rates for Indigenous peoples? Can we focus on decarceration? Can we talk about community supports? Can we talk about paying teachers properly and fair wages? Like, we need to get back to business instead of it all being about them. That's not what a government's supposed to be. It's supposed to be about the people, and it's just been a horrendous charade of just all about them for a while, and I hope that this stops that.
I think it was Desmond Cole said it's like, Trudeau's sunning Jagmeet Singh, right? Like, they're there, you know what I mean? Like, and then allowing yourself to be put in that position. So I suppose we're supposed to see this as pragmatic. If I had to guess, I think the NDP is trying to play this like, let's move beyond politics, we're above the small petty things, we're focused on the bigger vision. Except that's not really what we mean when we say move beyond, when we're like, politicians are too focused on petty things, we mean stuff like, ridiculous arguments for performance purposes in Parliament. We don't mean actually making policy for the people. And the NDP, yes, let's move beyond being on TikTok or whatever you're doing, and let's actually, get a reasonable healthcare pension, plans for workers, actual movement on child poverty in this country. Can we get some water to reserves? Maybe, that would be good. If everybody had clean water, that's what we mean when we say get to work. So it completely also concedes the ability to say the government isn't doing anything for workers. The government isn't doing anything for the working class. If you live in a rural region, the government doesn't care about you, which is traditionally supposed to be an NDP base. But how can you go out and campaign in the NDP and you're like, the government isn't doing this, and you're like, but you're with the government. And you're like, shoot. You know what I mean?
I mean, I guess one thing we shouldn't lose sight of is as we narrow in on dissecting, the evident failings of the NDP strategy, I think it's still in terms of social movements and the terrain that we have to operate on over the next 3-4 years is that we are contending with a minority. And we're not dealing with a Liberal majority, which is always much harder to extract any kinds of concessions from. So despite the NDP's thoroughly lackluster ability to leverage this deal and the minority in general, I think it's still important that the NDP, rather than someone else, holds the balance of power. And in terms of stability, I know people have been trumpeting in the media the value of stability, but I think probably the most useful sense in which we have a stable terrain now is that we have very clear, stable targets for organizing and for campaigning and for trying to extract something. So even if the NDP has kind of like self-owned and disabled its ability to have anything, have a kind of continuous leverage, I think the terrain for us, popular progressive movements, is much better now than it was a year ago.
Well, speaking of the terrain at the moment, just to kind of switch the conversation a little bit to the landscape we're all facing after the convoy. It was interesting, the deal was presented by both parties actually as a response to this moment. Trudeau said in his speech that, it's responding to the growing threats to democracy, hyperpartisanship, toxic polarization. And then there are these suggestions that the deal was actually forged in the post-convoy conversations that were happening between Jagmeet Singh and Trudeau. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about how the political landscape in Canada has shifted since the occupation of Ottawa started. Elle, it's been a month since that convoy's occupation ended, and I guess I thought we could start by looking kind of in hindsight at what we think the political and economic forces were that fueled those protests.
Yeah, well, there's always what it claims to be and what it probably is. So again, we had the pretense that this was, a working class movement. We had all these people saying, this is a worker-led movement. And as we know, this has been, spoken to death. Like 90% of truckers were vaccinated and were not part of this movement at all. South Asian truckers, of course, have been raising issues about discrimination within the industry, and that wasn't anything we cared about, right? So even the construction of this as truckers and what the word trucker is supposed to invoke in terms of the salt of the earth, white working class, that, is the proper kind of worker, which even that is such a, this invocation always of the working class, particularly by the right, when obviously most of the working class now is your Uber driver, it's your retail worker. So I don't know. I mean, I've said this already, but, the idea that freedom is only constituted through whether or not you can go to Boston Pizza or whether they're going to check your vaccine passport versus, street checks and racial profiling of Black people, Indigenous people still not having rights on reserve. I mean, the very same people that say, this is about freedom of movement, and then, we need to secure the border. And you're like, oh, but what about freedom of movement for migrant workers? What about freedom of movement for people seeking other economic activity, right? You're not interested in deconstructing that. So it was freedom, as has always been understood in Canada, which is freedom for white people. So you got the National Post, having pictures of very generic arrests and being never before in Canada have we seen this kind of violence. And it's someone being normally handcuffed, and it's there's no knees on necks, there's no chainsaws, tearing down your building on ancestral territory. There's no, person in a wheelchair being dragged out as happened to, Sarah Jama and the youth in Hamilton, right? We're not seeing any of that, but suddenly the minute that it's these white bodies encountering policing after weeks of being given please leave. No, please leave again. No, here's your fifth notice. And I don't agree with, I don't like how these conversations force us into this idea of suddenly we all have to uphold policing or the idea that policing is just. It's not. And in fact, what this shows us is what has always underlined policing, which is that it upholds this white social order. But I'm just saying that, so it is quite galling, as usual, to see people genuinely pretending that this was always about freedom, this was about liberty, this is, now we successfully got rid of the mandates and all is well. But there's been a black skin mandate in this country for hundreds of years. There's Indigenous people literally until the 70s in Halifax, and across Canada couldn't drink off reserve without it being illegal. There are still control mechanisms on how Indigenous people move around this country and move onto their own territories and move through their own territories. And I don't see any of these freedom-loving politicians actually caring about that.
They want the freedom to yell and complain and arm themselves with weapons and engage in their own militias and target people and say whatever misinformation that they want, and just to be free, because up until now it's been a little bit difficult in their mind. I mean, all society is structured like that for some people. And I think that's what became really exposed in Ottawa, that, as this siege progressed, there were lots of Canadians supporting this, oh yeah, go freedoms. And there still are who support those people. But as it progressed and you saw that they didn't stand for anything, that they just wanted to overthrow government, put Trudeau in Guantanamo Bay of all places, to some people were saying to execute the media. And I think after a while, people realized, you know what? These are just white hate groups with trucks. That's all that is. This wasn't a truckers movement. This wasn't a convoy. This was just the far right coalescing together, and some of them had big trucks. And they could lay the entire capital of this country to siege, and they knew they could do it because they had people who were formerly or currently in the military helping them. They had police officers currently on force, previously on force helping them. You didn't see anybody being shot, and you would hope that they wouldn't. But it just shows just it's this appropriation of freedom and liberty and security and all of those things that we've actually really fought hard for. That it's just an appropriation of that to try to further their far-right politics and make it more of a populist movement, make it something like it's an alternative, like a viable alternative. Where in the past, none of these white hate groups ever got any media attention. They never got a soapbox that was sponsored by anybody else. They couldn't have asked for a bigger soapbox, and the media gave it to them, and politicians gave it to them, and police gave it to them. And we'll be the ones to have to pay the price for that as we go along, because that has recruited people, that has attracted people who were up until now very quiet about what they were doing, and it has empowered the large number of white hate groups that are in this country, and we all know Canada has the highest number, and that's really a public safety and national security issue. This goes well beyond politics.
Martin, just staying on this question of Elle mentioned there's the stated politics of the convoy, and then there's what's actually happening and what's actually driving it. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, is there any distinction to be made? Because in my mind, there is, between the organizers of these protests and the occupation and some of the people who participated in various cities' protests for a number of different reasons.
Yeah, I completely agree with Pam about the composition of the kind of core organizers. These guys, and primarily they were guys who, could camp out in their idling vans for 3 weeks. Those aren't working class people. You can't do that for 3 weeks with no income. Yeah. Those are middle class kind of owner operators of trucks, with a huge amount of financial backing by right-wing grifters. And that to me was the composition of the core, but with the help of the media initially, I think especially, who is ready to give a platform to the right in a way they never would for, popular movements from the left. It was pretty incredible how they were able to launder their message, through bouncy castles and rock and roll concerts. It was striking to me how much genuine working class sympathy, I think across the spectrum, the movement won. And that to me, was a telltale sign of how little of that discontent that is legitimate, I think, economic discontent, at life during the pandemic and how costs have gone up and how inequality has been soaring in this country even before the pandemic. I think they managed to tap into that in a way that the NDP simply hasn't done because they haven't tried, or they haven't done it effectively, certainly. And so that to me was a disconcerting element, an impact of the convoy. I mean, there's a stat that I often cite, which is Frank Graves, who's a pollster with Ecos, has been polling this question for about 10 years, and he's found consistent and, in fact, slightly growing numbers on this. But he's found that when he's asked people if inequalities continue to accelerate and the benefits accrue to only those at the very top, would you be surprised to see violent class conflict emerge? And 2/3 of Canadians agree with that statement. And so that to me is an indication of how much rightful and righteous anger there is at the daily, state of affairs that the majority, multiracial working class majority in this country endure.
So speaking of tapping into people's anger at the elite, someone who's been doing a lot of that lately is Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative Party candidate. He's been kind of positioning himself as a faux populist and talking about being in tune with the working class, taking on the elite. And here's a clip, actually, we can watch together of him and sort of establishing his credentials for a recent campaign video.
On probably 200,000 doors in my political career. I've never had someone, almost never had someone come to the door and tell me where they fit on the political spectrum. They say I'm a trucker, I'm a single mom, who can't afford groceries, I'm a carpenter who can't get licensed to work, I'm a 25-year-old student with too much debt, and I'm stuck living in my parents' basement. They don't say to me that they fit anywhere on a political spectrum of left or right. One of the reasons why politicians fail is because they use that phony left-right spectrum to try to situate their policies, rather than making policies based on simple core principles that affect people's lives.
So what's going on here? What's Poilievre doing? Has he really somehow managed to transcend this left-right spectrum?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's always interesting. This man has been a professional politician since he was, 24 years old. But then it's like, the elites, right?
Even younger, I think.
So that's not uncommon. The other thing I think is interesting there is obviously no one's going to say that if somebody knocks on your door. Like, if a politician knocks on your door, who's going to be like, well, first, I did this chart. This one, right is here and left is here, and this is authoritarian, and I'm over here in this quadrant. I answered question. Like, obviously, no one's going to say it. It's a statement without meaning. Like, when a politician comes to your door, you're going to be like, I'm sorry, I don't vote Conservative, or yes, I voted for you last election. Like, who gets into a discourse on their place on the political spectrum anyway? Like, that doesn't happen when someone knocks on your door, right? So, I don't know. We can do some breach math here. I don't know if we have like a giant calculator we can pull up, but he says he's knocked on 200,000 doors in his political career. So I just want to pause and interrogate this, because he often represents himself as like a facts and numbers person, right? That all he does, when people are like, oh, you're very combative in Parliament, he's like, I just asked for facts. So he said 200,000 doors. So if we give 5 minutes per door, because people are sharing that they're a single mom, like groceries, there's real conversations here. That's 1 million minutes per year, right? I mean, that's 1 million minutes total. He's been in politics since 2004. So when you do the math, I think that works out to, it's almost 18 hours per week. Every single week, he would have to be knocking on doors to be talking to this many people. So the man sits in Parliament for a significant portion of that. So I just have this vision of somebody sitting on their couch, and you're you hear a knock on your door, and you're like, oh, it must be my Uber Eats. I'll go open the door, and you open it, and it's Pierre, and he's like, are you a plumber? What's your grocery situation? You're like, Pierre, it's not even an election. I'm not in your riding. I don't understand this door knocking thing. It's absurd. Like, there's no way you are knocking on 200,000 doors. Like, did you take any time off for COVID? So yeah, I mean, I don't even want to say his name that much because I feel like if I say his name 3 times, he's gonna knock on my door like right now.
I know.
Poilievre, knock. And he's Poilievre, you know, it's like he appears. I'm manifesting my like 50th visit of the night. You know, like I have a quota. I mean, what does he walk from house to house too? I don't know. You know, so yeah.
Point taken. That said, I think what he's doing is like a smart and dangerous tactic, drawn from a very classic like populist playbook. And I don't see any of the other conservative politicians doing this, or anywhere near as well as he does. I think O'Toole tried it a little bit, but it's also clearly like catching on. I mean, he put out a video, like, I think at the height of the Convoy that had like 4 million views, in which he was talking about, you know, feeling working class pain and talking about people losing control over their lives and, you know, pointing to the financial and corporate elite. And I think what's interesting about this video is that he is not polarizing. He's not attempting to polarize people along the right and left pole, right? Which most people have very fixed reactions to, despite what he says. What he's doing is trying to polarize people along top and bottom, right? So, you know, an overwhelming majority arrayed against a, you know, thin like layer of financial corporate elite. And I think that connects with people. I mean, we know that like 67% of Canadians think, rightly, that the economy is rigged in the interests of the wealthy and elite, right? And, you know, of course, by his own admission in the past, he is a stalwart member of the far right of the Reform origin Conservative Party. He's part of the libertarian wing of the party. The Breach published a long article that was really excellently kind of laid a taxonomy of his trajectory. He literally hasn't changed his far right opinions since he was 19. You know, he wants to bash the unions, stop people from getting abortions. He has an anti-LGBTQ agenda. When he was 19, he was praising Ralph Klein's and Stockwell's Day's attempts to put workers on a diet in Alberta, cutting and slashing the welfare state and social programs. So that's his agenda, which is squarely on the right. But he's quite adept, I think, at positioning himself as a fighter on behalf of the working poor. And I mean, if we go by just some of the way his videos have caught on, it seems to some degree to be working. And I think that it's working especially because there isn't a similar kind of alternative from the NDP that actually channels that rage towards the elite. And if anything, the new deal between Jagmeet and Justin actually sets up Poilievre pretty well. Like, he can claim that, you know, this is a pact between out of touch, you know, liberals, members of the elite, and if what we see from this pact is, you know, the same old, you know, incremental improvements alongside inequality exploding policies and climate incinerating policies, then you know, I think he could have the fuel he needs for you know, certainly to take the leadership of the Conservative Party, but also a challenge for prime ministership, I think.
What do you think, Pam? Just both about Poilievre's strategy, but in general, how the Conservative Party is capitalizing on the Convoy and this deal.
The Conservative Party actually knows what it's doing. I don't think the Conservative Party right now actually is any kind of cohesive or remotely unified party. I think you see some individuals coming out super far right, super truckers. Then you have others who are a little bit on the quiet side. And then you have, you know, the old group who are wondering what happened to the Conservative Party and worry about this extreme far right version. I mean, they did it to themselves by uniting with the far right, and being the far right and not calling out the far right, but that's where they are right now. And I think a lot of damage was done after the siege to the Conservative Party, because very early on, they were literally the first to jump out and take a selfie with a trucker, as if this was about, supporting this working class. But as the siege rolled on, and as there was more assaults and threats and stalking and property damage and people not being able to work, never mind the working class, people who actually couldn't work, you saw people not thinking that this was a good thing. So I think they jumped on the bandwagon pretty quickly. And he keeps sending out these nice messages to truckers. It reminds me of the same thing that Trump did when he would send out little nudge, nudge, wink, winks to white supremacist groups or KKK groups or others by trying to make it look like, there's good and bad on both sides, when we know that this is a significant problem. I don't think he's smart. I don't think he is at all an adept politician. I think what he does know is how to evoke rage, how to agitate, how to exploit it, how to manipulate it, how to get views on social media, how to trigger algorithms, exactly what you need to do to get attention. But ultimately, he's proven himself over the years to be little more than anecdotal, not at all factual, super contrarian. Regardless of what the issue is, he has something negative to say about it, and all about one-liners. He's all surface and aggression, but he's very little substance, and he doesn't really stand for anything. He invokes all of these anecdotes, but he doesn't really stand for anything that's good or that would help people. Because when Martin did the rundown, being anti-union, anti-teacher, anti-nurse, anti-black, anti-indigenous by comments that he's said. I mean, remember, right before the apology, he was out saying, we're not getting value for our money with the residential school settlement.
One thing I'll disagree with is this idea that anything ever gets to hang on Conservatives. I mean, this is one of the things that's enraging, right? That he can go out, shake hands with the truckers, and now he's saying, it was a small minority. In fact, it was still Trudeau was wrong, because I think the language he uses, put his fangs out and used extremely insulting language to these good people, right? So they're still clinging to that idea. But of course, they can go shake hands with the truckers and none of that behavior hangs on them. They get to say, not that part. Whereas we get held responsible for the behavior of people in other countries, right? Like if a black person shoots another black person in Chicago, it's like, well, I thought you wanted to defund the police. Yeah. Black people are, and it's like, that has nothing to do with Halifax, right? And I have to be accountable for some black man in Chicago, but you don't have to be accountable for the speeches you make yourself and your own associations, because that's purity politics, right? So we get this very bad apples type rhetoric that, Conservatives are always able to get away with. It's actually astonishing, but not at all surprising. You saw that in the provincial NDP in Ontario, they removed someone from running or wouldn't let someone run because they called Doug Ford a murderer, right? And it's that's uncivil, So you can't run if you call Doug Ford a murderer, even though factually, people died during COVID because of policies that Doug Ford made. But, Poilievre doesn't have to be accountable for anything anybody said in the convoy, because that's tarring everybody with a racist brush and that's unfair politics. But Trudeau's actually the one who's wrong because he said mean things, right? So
we talked about Poilievre and some other Conservatives trying to tap into this kind of faux populism to win over the working class. I want to also turn to the NDP and Jagmeet Singh in particular, trying to exercise their own kind of populism or populist rhetoric. And this is a clip from Jagmeet Singh speaking in Parliament while the convoy was happening.
You're right to be angry that you work hard and pay your taxes, but the super wealthy and big businesses don't pay their fair share. And you are right to be angry that your life has become harder, while the super wealthy and powerful have only added to their wealth and power. I'm angry too.
Leaving aside the slightly awkward like demeanor that he had throughout that whole thing, what's your take on this?
Well, I just think is he really angry? Like, I don't actually feel it. It's like
I'm angry too.
it's like I'm angry too. He's like trying to convince himself he's angry. Even this kind of rhetoric we haven't really often seen from him. You know, like I know for a fact from from a former advisor of his that he doesn't even like the term elite and establishment, like using them. You know, so. Which to me is strange because it's literally a description of how the world is run. And I guess the whole irony of this speech is that, to me, this is clearly the approach that the NDP should be taking, and should be taking earnestly and sincerely, like a polarization strategy that polarizes the electorate around the kind of progressive supermajorities that exists around, like, major taxation on the wealthy and a Green New Deal that combats the climate crisis and inequality at the same time, and making clear that the Liberal Party only serves the wealthy and their kind of corporate constituency as their main audience, main political audience, and through that trying to realign Canadian politics and marginalize the Liberals, but. I mean, that to me is the task. But to do it well, you'd have to like genuinely challenge people's rage. And to my mind, like, how can you be living in this country and not angry? Not angry at like the cell phone companies that are ripping you off, or the oil companies that are incinerating our climate, or the arms dealers through the Liberal government who are arming bloody dictatorships in Saudi Arabia.
Yes, people can't pay for groceries. Like, the price of food is sky high right now. The price of just basic commodities is sky high. People can't send their kids to post-secondary education. People can't live in the same town as their elderly parents because they have to move. Like, these are all realities. It's not like we haven't seen Bernie Sanders effectively tap into this by simply talking about class, economy, billionaires, the inequality exists, the fact that people can't get healthcare. Like, I mean, what's amazing in Canada is how fast, like, the right-wing stuff moves to us, right? That gets absorbed right away. And we have versions of Trumpism. We have versions of whatever's happening there, the right-wing money that comes in and funds the convoy. And then something as basic as Bernie Sanders understanding this. And I'm not saying Bernie's perfect, but I'm saying that, he had young people. He had a multiracial coalition, even though people said it was all white people. It wasn't. He had, he won the Latino vote in Nevada, like the workers in the casinos. He was able to really tap into a lot just by talking about these economic issues consistently, and everybody believed him. Everybody knew that he had worked his whole life for that. It was real. And it isn't that hard, one would think, to be able to talk about that, to genuinely say that. So this is what I mean. Like, Poilievre isn't wrong when he says single mothers can't pay their bills. They can't. He isn't wrong when he says that you have, 25-year-old students that have no hope of owning a home or drowning in debt. Of course, he has no plan to cancel student debt. That's not something that's going to happen. But these are the correct things. These are true. So, of course, if one person says that, you're going to say, well, that person is speaking to me. And the rest of these people are talking about all these policies that don't sound like they apply to me, make no sense. I don't have time to read these 500 pages about a climate deal. I want the person that talks to me about groceries. So, as Martin said, it's a complete miss of the opportunity here. It's ridiculous because we already have a very strong model from the States on how this rhetoric is effective that could be adapted into Canada if we wanted to. And we have our own history of these movements. Like, the NDP used to be in places like Cape Breton, was run by the NDP as a mining town. And now they don't get voted for out there. Like, why? Because people have abandoned this very basic rhetoric that speaks to people. So then, yeah, of course, it leaves the lane open for the populist right to come in. It completely leaves the field open for anyone to come through who's able to then speak to this very real. So nobody's dismissing that very real anger, the very real struggles people are having, the very real losses people are experiencing, the fact that people have no savings, no ability to own a home, no ability to get any like capital equity. This is real for people. And that's what people need to hear.
That feels like a good note to end things on. Thank you so much to all three of you for joining us, Pam, Al, Martin. That was fun. And thanks to all of you for watching or listening to the show. If you're on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to our channel and press like on this video if you enjoyed the conversation. And if you appreciate the work we do, please consider becoming a sustaining member of The Breach. You can do that by going to breachmedia.ca. I'm Donya Ziaee, and I'll see you next week.